becoming an industrialist, or becoming someone who actually manufactures something at scale and creates an ethical product that people enjoy and doesn't necessarily harm the world, but does better. It's not something that fills me with a lot of joy, and it's something that I want to do, and I want to do for the rest of my life.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast, a show where we spotlight companies making money by making the world a better place. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and if you share a passion for using commerce to solve many of the world's most pressing problems, then this is the show for you. Hello, and welcome to episode number 92 of the Business for Good podcast. Thanks to those of you who reached out about episode 91 with Lisa Keefe, the editor of Meeting Place magazine. That's M-E-A-T in Place. Also, of course, the editor of Alt Meat magazine. And several of you said that you were really interested in hearing what somebody who was so steeped in the meat industry for so long was thinking about the alt meat industry. So I'm glad that you found that episode useful. And if you liked it, you will certainly like this one too, because we are staying in the alt meat vein for a little while here. And so if you think about it, like Lisa was talking about how she wishes that there was better whole cut products, because for decades, the alt meat movement is focused on ground meats like sausages, burgers, nuggets, sticks, and more. That's because it's just a lot less difficult to create these ground products than a more structured product like a steak or a chicken breast. It's still difficult, but it's less difficult. Now, several companies, though, are trying to reach that holy grail of whole cut products, and one of them is Chunk Foods, hailing from the Holy Land of Israel. As you'll hear in this episode, Amos Golan was a guy who was just fascinated by chemistry. He tried a couple business ideas that frankly didn't take off before starting to make steaks in his kitchen by putting soy through a special kind of fermentation process. After many failures, he finally created something he thought was worthy of showing to investors, one of whom was interested enough that they put in $50,000. Fast forward to today, and Amos has been making quite a lot of innovations in his process. He's making steaks that I tried and really enjoyed, and is now overseeing a team of 12 people helping him make those steaks. He has raised millions of dollars, and he claims that these steaks are going to be hitting U.S. shelves by the end of 2022. Time will tell whether that prediction pans out, and I certainly hope that it does. But Amos has an impressive story that offers a good reminder to never give up, and that the most meaningful work of your life may still be ahead of you.
Amos, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be on with you. Greetings from California to Israel here. So glad to be talking with you. You have really taken much of the alternative protein world by storm, because your company, Chunk Foods, was founded less than 2 years ago. We're recording this in the spring of 2022. And you were founded less than 2 years ago, but you're making products that really look very advanced. So let me just ask you, before we get into how you did this and why you did it and so on, what were you doing 2 years ago? Like, what were you doing prior to Chunk Foods? Because I certainly weren't familiar with you, but what were you doing 2 years ago?
So 2 years ago, I actually lived in the U.S., moved there a couple of years before that. And, one thing led to another, went to grad school in Boston, and then moved to New York to join Ferrero, the giant chocolate company, as part of the Open Innovation Science team that was based in New York. So I worked there on a bunch of innovation projects in packaging, ag tech, food tech, biotech, really interesting stuff. And actually, some of the things I saw there and some of the ideas led to the work on Chunk, which happened during the fall of 2020.
Why go to chocolate? What was the attraction for you?
So it's a bit of a long story, but I actually got to meet the Ferrero folks when I was at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab, working on one of the projects. So Ferrero is a very large company that has businesses in different parts of the confectionery market, and one of their businesses is around is the Kinder Surprise, which is basically the chocolate eggs that all of the kids in Europe know, and some kids in the US also know in a different form as the Kinder Joy. It's a different product. And I did a small project with them at the Media Lab, got to know the teams, got really excited about some of the work they do, and got an offer to join the Open Innovation Science team, which seemed very appealing, working on cutting edge technologies, finding solutions for some of the supply chains issues that we see nowadays, and many more super interesting challenges. So decided to take it and move to New York and join the team.
How did that present it to you? So how did that present itself to you, Amos? So if you think about, like you said, you went to grad school in Boston, so you were at MIT. What were you studying that you ended up getting this offer, and that you're looking at supply chains and packaging and all these other things for a huge chocolate company?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, to answer that question, I probably should go a little, back and kind of tell you more about my career path, because it was all over the place. I started my career in cooking. I, went to cooking school in London at the Cordon Bleu, and thought that, I'm going to work as a chef and become a chef. Worked in a couple of restaurants, did that for a while, and when at some point said, well, it's not really exactly what I want to do. I'm really interested in food and eating food and cooking for people, but I'm also really interested in how things are made and what are they made of, and got really curious about the science behind things. So, I decided to stop doing that, sign up for school at Tel Aviv University, and decided to study chemistry. So I did that for a couple of years, shifted from cooking to sciences, worked as a scientist and led R&D in a couple companies. And then at some point I was like, okay, so I'm doing science now, but now I want to turn that into something even more practical again. And I heard about this, crazy program at MIT called the MIT Media Lab, where there's a lot of focus on engineering and a lot of focus on working with sponsors, with these large companies that bring in real world problems to the university, and they work together to solve them and bring in, these crazy new technologies. So I decided to try my luck and sign up for a second master's at the Media Lab. And this is how I got to the Media Lab. Now, the way the Media Lab is structured, there are tens of sponsors that basically that are large corporations like Ferrero, Bose, Target, and many, many others, Google, Facebook. And they bring in some of the challenges or the things that they're interested in and present them to the students and professors. And basically, they form these interest groups, they form these collaborative projects where students and professors work on some of these problems, and also suggest new creative ways to solve them, or just new creative ways of interacting with the world. And this collaboration between students, professors, researchers, and these companies really sparked my interest. And so at one point, we were working on a project with Ferrero around these chocolate eggs that I mentioned. And there's a long history of why Kinder Surprise chocolate eggs are not sold in the U.S. And some other products that were brought to the U.S. As an alternative to these chocolate eggs. But it's a very successful product in Europe, and most kids, most people my age who grew up eating those and sharing the joy of finding a toy and assembling a small toy and eating great chocolate. So it was a childhood experience. It was a really interesting project. How can you bring these products to the US? How can you make the toys super safe? How can you make them more intriguing for kids? And that project, which was very successful, is going to lead to a launch of a toy, new toy category for Kinder Surprise in the US, Kinder Joy in the US, really sparked my interest and got me to know this amazing company. So then when they got to know me, I got to know them, and they made this offer to join a team that was looking into all these super interesting challenges around supply chain, around new technologies in ag tech and food tech. It really sounded amazing and sounded like something that I may have an edge in, because I've done so many things around engineering, science, and also cooking and eating food. So this was kind of the background for this.
So what happened? I mean, you're doing toys, you're doing chocolate, and then all of a sudden you're thinking, actually, I want to disrupt the meat industry. Like, what was it? Did you have an interest in sustainability? Are you a vegetarian? Like, what was the impetus for you to think, I don't want to do toys, I don't want to do chocolate, I want to do meat?
Well, I think it's, again, there are a couple of reasons. I think I was lucky to move to the US in the summer of 2016, which I think was a pivotal moment for the whole industry. I mean, you had the Impossible and Momofuku collaboration, Beyond launched in Whole Foods. It was, meat alternatives were all the rage. And I came from Israel, which is quite advanced, but still these things didn't happen here, and moved to the US, and suddenly it's all around you. Got super curious. You started seeing the Beyond Burger in every cool restaurant, and you started seeing it at Whole Foods. And I got really intrigued by the the offering and also the prospect of this really making an impact on all of us, right? And then when I went to the supermarket, I looked at the meat case, or and I saw some of these products, and I was thinking to myself, why is everyone fighting for the cheapest product in the meat case? Like, why are we not looking at the other products that are out there, which are the steaks and the roasts and what the fish fillets? Why are we not looking at the products which have a higher price point, where we could really make a difference, because we will be able to sell the product at price parity or cheaper, and then make the choice a lot easier for people. I mean, people are very sensitive to price. This was my hypothesis, and I think time and time again we see that in surveys. People are very sensitive to price. So I was thinking, what if we could offer them the premium products that they like, but just offer a better alternative? And another thought that I had was, you take the package from the shelf, and you look at the back, and you look at the label, and you see quite a lot of ingredients, and some of them today are more familiar to people. But back then, I didn't know many people who knew what methyl cellulose was. And I was thinking, we're trying to take something like meat or fish out of people's menus, or at least reduce the amount of these products that they use. And these things are staples, right? People are used to eating them and consider them as an ingredient. So we really need to make an offering with whatever we offer that will replace these things, that people will see as a healthy option, as a good replacement for a staple. And that just seems like something that's harder to do when you have 20 or 30 ingredients than something that would have less ingredients. So this was the motivation, basically.
So let me ask you a provocative question then, Amos. So if you think about, let's say, somebody going into Burger King, and they're faced with a choice. They're faced with a choice between a regular Whopper and the Impossible Whopper. How many of those people do you think are contemplating the length of the ingredient list of the Impossible Whopper, or whether it has something like methyl cellulose as an ingredient versus other considerations that are on their mind?
I think none, or very few. I think you've just brought up the single best use case for these products, I think. And to me, it's a non-brainer. Like, I would never eat a meat-based Burger King again, because I think that the plant-based option is better. And I think it's obviously, it's better in any single way. I think what becomes an issue is when people who are used to eating meat and fish on a daily basis, they eat, they eat a burger once a week or twice, once a month or twice a month, but they eat other types of meat. They eat, they have, moms and dads and grandmothers and grandparents who cook the food that they grew up on, and they would want to cook the same kind of food for their kids. And I think a lot of people are looking for something that's more versatile than just a burger. And when that becomes something that you eat on a regular basis, on a daily basis, then people are looking for something different. So I think as a replacement for something like a Burger King burger, I think what we have now is perfect. And I think it's only getting better. But I think for the other use cases, we're still lacking. And I think we don't have good enough options, specifically around whole cut, plant-based fish and seafood alternatives. And the only way to convert people is to create different and better options.
Yeah, sure. I definitely agree. I think that the only way people are going to switch is if they have something better to switch to. That's pretty much going to be the only way. And I don't mean better from an ethical or a sustainability perspective, although that's, of course, extremely important for me, and I presume for you, but I doubt it is for most people who are thinking about whether to buy a sirloin steak versus, in the future, a Chunk Foods steak, for example. You mentioned almost the price issue and how there's a difficulty getting to price parity with conventional plant-based products that are relying on the ingredients that they do. So first, let me ask you, why do you think it is that it's so difficult to get to price parity right now? And then let's get into what you're doing that you believe will enable you to actually quickly get to price parity with conventional meat.
Sure. I think, obviously we still don't manufacture at very large scale. So challenges around supply chain are always going to be an issue until you scale to a certain size, and then you get different kinds of challenges, of course. But I think that the core issue with the products we see in the market today is that they're competing with very cheap animal-based products. I think that when your starting point is an expensive product, so when consumers compare your product to a more expensive product, and I think you mentioned that in your show, Paul, around if someone was able to make a plant-based lobster, and you would be able to compare that to the price of lobster, then obviously there's a much bigger margin to be made there, where you can scale up, more easily. There's more room to make error and more room to kind of build supply chains as you scale. While taking on some of these higher prices, but I think when you're after something as cheap as a burger or ground beef, which is, I don't know, the average in the US is probably around $3.8 a pound, or at least that was the price when I lived there. There's very little room for margins, and that's why we still see the leading products at the price premium of about 2x. So I think the starting point of having just like competing with a much more expensive products really allows you to be at price parity or even cheaper.
Interesting. So you're making an argument then by going after these whole cut steaks, let's say, that it's not necessarily that your products will be cheaper than, let's say, Beyond's ingredients, but rather that you're just going after a category where the bar is much easier to meet because the initial starting competitor product is so much more expensive. That's what you're saying?
Exactly. I mean, we are relying on commodities, trying to work with ingredients that are cheaper, but still great, very nutritious and of the best quality, of course. We do have less ingredients, which also simplifies your bill of materials, of course. And we may talk about it a little later. We're using fermentation to also, give some umami flavors, which reduce the need of, very high amounts of natural flavors, which add obviously to the to the bill of materials. But yeah, I mean, essentially what you're saying is absolutely right. If consumers compare you to a more valuable product, you're able to sell your product at a higher price point, and that by doing so, absorb some of the associated costs and still make a margin while selling the product at a price parity or potentially even cheaper.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting thought experiment, because right now the conventional wisdom is that if plant-based meat were cheaper, it would take up a much bigger share of the market. So plant-based meat today, it's like less than 1% of the total volume of meat that is being sold pretty much anywhere, including in the United States. And Jason Lusk of Purdue University recently did a study where it was, based on self-reported willingness to pay, but essentially people said if the Beyond Burger were priced the same as a conventional burger, that 27% of them would switch, which is obviously a huge number to switch, 27%. But I've wondered, if, we have, for example, plant-based lobster, like you mentioned, or plant-based crab cakes or plant-based foie gras, these are all extremely expensive products. I mean, some species of crab right now are going for like $30 a pound, not $3 a pound, but $30 a pound. And foie gras is generally like $50 a pound. And so if you create alternatives to them that are substantially less expensive, how many people would switch to them? And I don't know the answer. It's an interesting thought experiment. But at what point does the person buying crab cakes say, as long as I get the same experience, I'm willing to switch to plant-based because I'm going to save some money? And I wonder that with steaks too. And so I'm eager to see when you come onto the market, what happens to that. We're going to get into that in a second. I will just note, companies like Beyond are relying heavily on pea protein, of course. And when I started my own company, the Better Meat Co., just over 4 years ago, I was thinking a lot about pea protein, and I wondered, would pea protein become more affordable or less affordable over time? And I didn't really know, but I thought it was going to be tough to see that price come down. And indeed, pea protein prices have skyrocketed. They're way more expensive now than before, despite the fact that they've become more mainstream. And so even in the last year or so, pea protein prices have more than doubled due to drought and increased demand and so on. And so it's really hard to envision how they end up getting down to price parity with meat when the number one ingredient in their product just keeps increasing in cost. But I don't think you're using pea protein. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And, one of the strategic decisions we had very early on was to use soy as an existing commodity that has pretty established supply chains and a slightly better price point. With all the challenges associated with soy, right? Allergenicity and so on, and maybe a little bit of bad publicity. But yeah, I mean, soy is frankly, a magical ingredient and used all throughout the industry. So we decided to make the decision to work with soy. We work mostly with soy flour, so less so with the isolates and concentrates like most of our peers. But we have this fermentation process that we use, which is quite interesting, that allows us to make the most out of this soy flour. And, yeah.
Great. Well, I'm eager to talk about that fermentation process because that really is the secret sauce. People have been using soy flour to make alternative meats for literally decades, actually even longer than that. So I want to talk about what makes you all unique. But before we do, you mentioned bad publicity for soy. So I'm just going to use this opportunity just to state soy is awesome. It is shown to increase your muscle mass, decrease your risk of cancer. The myths around it are completely false. And it's a really great food. It's high protein. It's a complete protein. It's just a really wonderful food. I eat like edamame and tofu pretty much on a daily basis. And here is my free idea for any entrepreneur out there who wants to start something. Have you followed Amoss? Do you know what Liquid Death is, that brand of water? The canned water. Have you seen them?
Heard about it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we all kind of laugh at it, but the company's doing pretty well, and it's just marketing, right? It's just canned water, but it's this really funny marketing, and people are really into it, right? And so there's these myths around tofu, and people think of it, oh, this is like either they think it's like, oh, this is food for women, not for men, or for women even they have like negative associations with it, but pretty much it's perceived by some people, fallaciously as a food not for men. And so what about if somebody did a tofu for men? And get this, here's the name of it. You ready, Amos? Tofu. It's going to be called brofu. And they're like, this isn't your grandmother's tofu, and it's got like all types of images, kind of like men flexing, like doing curls with the bricks of tofu, and like I can see like the guy from the ad finishes the brick of tofu, and then he like drinks the juice from the carton, like all this stuff like that. That's my idea. So if anybody wants to start brofu, I hope you'll do it and let me know. You don't have to cite me. I'm fine, but I want that company to exist. So I'm a huge advocate for soy. I think it's maligned and a very good food, and I'm glad that you're using it. Now, first, before you tell us what you're actually doing to soy that's actually novel, what do you think about brofu?
I think it's a great idea, and I think there's hardly very few things that are more manly than tofu. So can't really understand why.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's a great food. It's a miracle food, and I had edamame last night for dinner as well. So.
Very nice. Good. Yeah. All right. Good. Well, your biceps must be pumping then, because it's a great way to build muscle. All right. Good. Well, if Chunk Foods doesn't work, you can always do brofu. Okay.
Thanks for the idea. I'll keep it. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about what you're doing, man. Like, I really want to know. So you have soy flour, and obviously, don't give away anything that's proprietary, but I presume you're filing for IP, so it's all going to be public anyway. But like, what is the innovation that Chunk Foods is spearheading here?
So a couple of things there. I think, some of the challenges associated with soy in our industry are some of these green beanie notes that are associated with it. And oftentimes, people just say, you need to mask the flavors, you need to get, to add a lot of natural flavors to it to cover or mask it. So one thing that we do, which, we're really working hard on, is to use the fermentation as a way to remove some of these off flavors and get some nice umami base below the natural flavors that we add on top to really complement the flavor of the product. So that's one thing that we try to do. The other thing is really to create structure. So, what we see today in the market is obviously mostly in the ground beef and patty kind of section, is basically different kinds of granules made in different ways that are formed into a patty with binders. But we don't have this directionality that's quite dominant in whole cut meats, right? So meat is made of these fibers that are bundled together into fiber bundles, and then have this connective tissue that holds everything together into a cut. And obviously there's the intramuscular and extramuscular fat that kind of complements the whole thing and makes it the steak that we know and we see in the supermarket shelf. So what we do is we try to replicate this structure by creating, replicating this structure, basically creating fibers and creating something that holds these fibers together. So we have a way to form the soy flour into this unidirectional structure, basically something that has the shape of these fibers. We ferment that with natural non-GMO organisms, and as a result, what we get is a solid cut that has directionality. We can control this directionality. That cut also holds water and fat quite well. So we get a very moist and juicy product. And we do all of that without binders like methyl cellulose.
Interesting. So, and just to be clear, there's various styles of fermentation. Sometimes when people think about fermentation, they're thinking about, stainless steel fermenters that are filled with liquid, and then you introduce organisms to it. You're not doing that kind of fermentation, though. So tell us about what exactly your type of fermentation at Chunk is all about.
Yes. So, some parts of this process are obviously proprietary, but as you mentioned, rightfully so, Paul, I think the two types of fermentation, generally speaking, two types of fermentation, one that's done in these giant stainless steel fermenters, either biomass or precision fermentation. And then there's the more traditional types of fermentation, which are essentially all versions of solid state fermentation. So a process in which you take a source of protein, it can be animal source, it can be like milk or meat, and it can be plant-based, like the soybeans that are used for making miso. And then you ferment them with different organisms, either natural flora that is found on these ingredients, or organisms that you add, basically that you inoculate the product with. So we are closer to this category. So we're closer to the category of solid state fermented foods, just like coffee and cocoa and bread, and some cheeses and some sausages and many other foods that we all, many of us consume on a daily basis.
Cool. So when I think about like solid state soy fermentation, what comes to my mind is tempeh. So you take a bunch of whole soybeans and you inoculate them with an organism called rhizopus, and you let them basically partially digest those soybeans, and it creates this cake, right? It's like a brick, and you cut it open, you can see the whole soybeans that are in there, and then that white filament that is holding everything together, that is the mycelium. That's the rhizopus mycelium that is essentially keeping all those soybeans intact. And that's very different from what you're doing, though. Am I right about that?
It's quite different. Yeah, it's quite different. But, I think some of the foods that come to mind when one talks about solid state are definitely tempeh, natto, that's quite famous in Japan, using Bacillus subtilis, and many more. Bread, of course.
So how did you come across this? Are you the inventor of this product? Did you think you're just going to tinker? You have a chemistry background. Maybe you're going to tinker yourself and then see what happens. How did this actual process get invented here?
Yeah, so I had this idea how to create structure with fermentation. Basically, I saw read a bunch of patents, saw a bunch of companies doing really interesting stuff around fermentation and fermentation of different plant materials. And, I had this hypothesis, there's a way to create structure. I had this idea, and there's a way to use the fermentation process to slightly improve the soy and beanie notes of different grains and legumes. And I just started experimenting. So actually, I looked up on Amazon, on eBay, started buying equipment, and retrofitted my Brooklyn apartment. Back then I lived in New York, and turned it into a small improvised lab. And between that small lab and our kitchen, I created the first prototype. There were quite a few terrible tasting prototypes before the first one that actually tasted like something interesting. And that, my wife and I were tasting them regularly. And at some point she said, well, it's quite good. When are you making this again? And at that point, something clicked, and I decided to send a couple samples to investors I knew. And this was following, conversations I already started having with the GFI in the US and with other people, and kind of learning the field and understanding what the white spaces are. So one thing led to another. I managed to raise a very small check, and this led to the company.
What is very small?
It was a $50,000 check. It was a SAFE from a fund called E14, which is a fund that supports the greater MIT community. And I knew these folks, so it was easy to send them a product. And a couple of weeks later, this turned into an investment.
Wow, that's really great. That's really great. So for those not familiar, a SAFE as an acronym, it stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And it basically is a way that early stage companies can raise some cash without actually having to start selling shares just yet, because the equity will get converted when you do an actual more conventional equity round. So that's really cool. So, I mean, who would have thought, or maybe you would have thought, that just tinkering around in your kitchen would land you somebody who believes in you at least to put $50,000 into your idea?
Yeah, I tried a couple of times with other ideas before, and it didn't work. I think it's really a matter of finding. No, it's a matter of finding the right thing. Looking back at the things I did, when I did them, they didn't necessarily make sense. But nowadays, I really see how the dots connect, and how each and every experience really gave me something that is now part of the business that I'm building. So very grateful for all these experiences.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the business that you're building, but just let me ask you first, Amos, what's your motivation? Like, what's the thing that gets you out of bed in order to keep doing this? Lots of people have different motivations who are in this particular field of alternative protein. Some are in it because they really care about animals. Some are caring about sustainability or feeding the world. Others just want to succeed and they think this is a good business opportunity. There's other reasons too. People are interested in public health or pandemic prevention. What is it that really motivated you? Like, obviously, you didn't come from a background of necessarily, looking at alt protein or animal welfare or anything like that. Like, you were in toys and chocolate. You said you had other ideas that presumably were not meat related that you were tinkering around with when you were in Brooklyn as well. So what is it that leads you to want to do this?
I think nowadays it's really about sustainability. I think it's something that kind of grows in you when you understand, when you learn a field, by learning that field, you learn all the problems that are associated with it, right? So I think the initial interest was just curiosity. Like, can we make something better? Can we solve this challenge? I was interested in the challenge of solving something that wasn't solved until these days, basically. Like, how can we address these other markets? But I think the more I learn about it, the more I read about it, the more I meet founders, and you really understand the problems, right? And I think sustainability to me is today the biggest driver. It affects the way I try to live my life, also not necessarily only related to food, and the way I see things. So definitely the biggest motivation would be sustainability today, and also curiosity. And last but not least, always, and this is kind of a personal note, but becoming an industrialist, or becoming someone who actually manufactures something at scale and creates an ethical product that people enjoy and doesn't necessarily harm the world, but does better. It's not something that fills me with a lot of joy, and it's something that I want to do, and I want to do for the rest of my life.
Definitely inspiring. I feel you on that for sure. It's also interesting. There's a saying that is often, I don't know who originally said it. I first heard the author A.J. Jacobs say it, but I don't think that he is the one who invented it. But since I heard it from him, I'll attribute it to him, where he said that it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. And so basically, you could start out saying, hey, like, I care about sustainability, therefore I'm going to go start this company. But really, in your case, the opposite was true, that you have acted your way into a new way of thinking, that sustainability is more important to you now than maybe it was a couple of years ago because you have been engaged in this endeavor, wouldn't you say?
I think it was also always important. I think, saying that something is important to you and actually acting on it is very different. And I think, what this afforded me was a way to actually dive deeper into what that means to care about something like sustainability or animal welfare in the case of many other founders and so on. I mean, obviously I care about animal welfare, but this was not the motivation. So this is why I'm not putting that as the main driver there. But
yeah.
And I think once you realize that your actions can actually make a difference and that you can actually build something, considerably large with engaging other people in the mission, that becomes very different than just talking about something or writing about something, trying to really make a difference through action.
Yeah. Well, speaking of making a difference, Amos, let's talk about how you're building this. So you're tinkering around in your kitchen in Brooklyn. You come up with something that's like a prototype or a minimum viable product here. You get $50,000 in a SAFE as an early investment. So what happens next? You take that $50,000 and what do you do with it?
It's a funny question, because I basically continue doing exactly what I did before I had the money and just spend everything out of pocket. No, I mean, I've tried to look for a co-founder for quite a while. This was really at the decision point whether we're going to move back to Israel or not. It was, kind of a couple months into COVID, and New York was a bit of a scary place to be in at the beginning of the pandemic. I started looking for a co-founder, had some engagements with people, hired some consultants to help with some aspects of the business and digging a little deeper into the feasibility of this thing. And then we had to move. So we had to move to Israel, and I used the money to set up the company. So, hire a lawyer, incorporate, do all these things that one needs to do. And then started hiring a couple people. Started the first team members. We hired a biologist to do some of the work around the fermentation. Then we hired
Had you raised more money by that point? I mean, you hired a lawyer, a biologist. You're incorporating. Is that all coming out of that initial $50K?
So, we already started having conversations on a proper pre-seed round, which at that point was, for the first couple months, I'd say 70% of my time was dedicated to fundraising, so to trying to raise more funds, and the other 30%, which was probably another 130%, because I feel like at that point in time, I was probably working like 20 hours a day, was dedicated to improving the prototype and creating samples. Buying raw material, buying some equipment, hiring that biologist. We managed to get to an agreement with the law firm, so we had to defer the payment. We're actually paying them now for the first time. So, we managed to kind of save money. But yeah, hiring that consultant, doing some of these things was what we were able to do with the $50K. And it got a little stressful. I worked out of we moved to Israel. I worked out of my parents' house. We still didn't have an apartment. Basically working out of my old equipment. I brought my equipment from Brooklyn with me. It was a challenging time, but we didn't spend that much. I tried to keep the burn rate very, very low.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it reminds me of the saying that Ben Horowitz from Andreesen Horowitz says, where he said that if you start your own company, you will sleep like a baby because you will wake up every 2 hours and cry. And so, and it's like you see this, you see that there is a highly causal relationship between the amount of money in your startup's bank account and the amount of cortisol in your veins. And it's like, and it's an inverse relationship. Like, and whenever people say, oh, like money isn't the answer to your problems, what I found talking to a lot of startup founders is that actually it really is the answer to a lot of the problems that people face, that having more money makes it much, much easier. And so what happened then? So, obviously you've raised a lot more than $50K now. So you went to work, you started creating more and more products, and then what occurred?
So, there was a bit of a learning curve how to make a food product, right? So it's very different to make product in your kitchen and put it in a vacuum bag and send it to people, and to make something that actually can keep in the fridge or in the freezer and, maintain its color and flavor and nutritional profile and so on. So, we basically, I was pitching all day and all night, with different time zones. You just wake up early in the morning and just pitch all the way through the night, and then prepare samples, wake up at 5 a.m. to prepare samples to send them all over the world, because I didn't really know how to even ship stuff. And, it's perishable, so it had to be frozen or kept chilled. And at that point, we just didn't really know how to do that well with different shipping companies. So, so anyway, we did that for a while. Then I had my wife's sister at that point was looking for a job. So I said, why don't you come and help me? So she started working with me, and she's now, leading all our operations. And started kind of attracting talent. And so people joined. The product improved. And then we managed to secure enough interest to have E14, who gave me that first small safe, to basically lead the round. So we negotiated the terms, and we raised $1.75 million on another safe. This time with a valuation and a proper safe with valuation and discount and so on.
Nice. What was the valuation on that $1.75 million round?
Yeah, I prefer not to share these numbers, but it was market rates at that point in time. It was decent. Okay. I thought it was great. It's always a little lower than you wish, but it was great. And we had a bunch of really great angels as well. And if I can say one thing is that angels. I mean, all of my I think all of my investors are super. I mean, they've helped a lot, but angels, and it doesn't matter how big their check is, they've just been great. I have some of my mentors today are people who didn't do a very large check, but have just been meeting on a regular basis every week or so, and it just helped me build this business from the ground up. So
yeah, it's one of the things that I find most interesting about the idea of investors, because so many people who I talk to who are like thinking about starting their own companies, they think of investors as just a source of capital. And what they don't think so much about is that actually, there's capital out there, and sure, you need it, of course, but you really want investors who are going to provide more than capital, who are going to provide you with advice, with connections, with information. Like, you don't know everything that you need to know. You don't know even a small fraction of what you need to know, most likely. And when you have investors, they're pretty people who are literally invested in your success. And why not utilize them? It's like having members of your team who aren't out on the field. Like, you want to get them out on the field because they put them to work. They own part of the company, so put them to work and make sure they can increase the chance that one day their shares are going to be worth something.
I totally agree. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think it depends on the specific stage of the company, right? Different investors would bring in, they have different flavors, and they would bring different value at different stages. But I think the early stage investors they're the ones who would help you raise the next round. They help with introductions. They help so much. And the problem with the first, especially for me as a first-time founder and solo founder, was also, it's not so much about the stuff that the unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns, right? There's so much stuff that you don't know that you should know. And people with a lot of experience just tell you, this is what you should do now. Did you think about that? Did you think about this? Just super helpful to have these mentors.
Yeah, for sure. So where's the product now? I ate it recently. As you know, you were kind enough to send me one of your steaks, and my colleagues and I tried it. We really liked it. It kind of reminded folks, especially our chef, of like a flank steak, and it was really good. It was definitely not like something else that I had before. And so it seems like you're really on to something. And I'd love to know, where's the product now? How much can you produce, and when will you start selling, and where will you start selling?
So most of the work in the last, I'd say 6 to 12 months was focused on scale up. We have a product that we're pretty happy with. It's obviously V1, and it's going to continue improving all the time. And the work now is really on taking the process that we've developed and scaling it up cheaply enough. So with food grade equipment, that without building too much fancy equipment or spending too much on capex, and setting that up in a food safe facility where we can actually make food and sell food out of. So today we stand at about, we can make tens of kilograms per day. Also depending on how many employees we have, but that's more or less a scale. We're building now a pilot facility with about 10 times that capacity, which will be ready by the end of this year. And
so by the end of 2022, you will be producing hundreds of kilograms a day of steaks.
Yes, exactly.
Great. And I presume that's in Israel.
So the first pilot is going to be in Israel. We're going to export that produce to other countries with a focus on the US market.
Why? Well, I mean, aren't there people who want to eat it in Israel?
Not enough. Unfortunately, Israel is quite small. No, I mean, Israel is quite small. I think also the habits of Israelis are quite different when it comes to consumer products. So and branding is obviously very different. So in order to really explore the market and understand how people respond to this essentially a new category that doesn't really exist in retail yet. We want to work with the target audience from the get-go and not start with a smaller market that's quite different and then try and utilize the learnings that we had and bring them to a different market. We want to start working with the US market from the very beginning.
Okay. So if that is so, why not just come back to the US and build a plant here?
So I think the idea is to have this dual structure where, which is what I started with. So the mother company, Chunk Foods US, is a US company, and we have this daughter company, the Israeli company, that does R&D and engineering for the mother company. And I think that structure works pretty well. We're going to have the commercial side and manufacturing in the US, but the R&D iterations in Israel are quite quick. I think it really works well with the kind of the Israeli character of moving quickly and breaking things, and just like the like 1 or 2 degrees of separation between me and every other Israelis, because it's such a small country. So this really helps with getting to the right people quickly, planning and moving really quickly with product development. So I think there's benefits to both things, and we're going to have this dual structure where engineering and R&D happens in Israel, and then we take this technical package and we bring it on to the US, where the manufacturing side and the commercial side can really scale that up and start selling the product and put them on the supermarket shelves.
Nice. Very nice. So I'm looking forward to that. Can't wait. Hope you make it all the way over to California so that I can go out and be one of your first customers then, Amos. But how many folks work at the company now? How many are working at Chunk Foods?
So we're 11 now. We're 11.
Okay. And I presume you're going to need a lot more than that. So you raised, nearly $2 million to date then. So are you going to be back out in the market seeking to raise again sometime in the near future then?
So we actually, we haven't announced yet, but we just closed a very significant round 3 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thanks. So we will announce that, in the coming weeks. And we're going to use these funds to expand. So we're definitely planning to start hiring both in the US and also expand the team in Israel, hoping to grow to about 25 to 30 people in the next year.
Nice. Oh, congratulations. So let me ask you, Amos, you've been on quite a ride. I mean, just 2 years ago, you were tinkering around in your kitchen. You tried some ideas that didn't work and that nobody wanted to invest in, apparently. And then you finally made something that somebody wanted to invest in. Now you're overseeing a team of about a dozen people. You've raised millions and maybe even tens of millions of dollars by now. It's quite a change in your life from 2 years ago to today. And just a good example of how you really never know what fate is going to bring for you in your life. So have there been any resources, Amos, that have been useful for you in these past couple of years in this roller coaster ride that you're on that you would recommend to somebody else who's in there thinking, oh, I really am impressed by what this dude has accomplished. Maybe I could do something like that too. So has there anything that you would recommend that was useful in your journey so far?
Yes. First of all, I just want to say, rely on your friends and family as much as you can, because that's more important and more helpful than any book or podcast or anything like that I can recommend, right?
Well, aside from this podcast, but the other ones for sure,
except for Paul's podcast, of course. But
Okay,
I think this roller coaster is something that's quite challenging, and relying on the people you love and the people who can support you is really the only thing that really helps. But I think there's a lot of things that help me a lot, in making less mistakes. I want to think that they help me make less mistakes, or at least know what to expect. So when it comes to the technicalities of what the deal looks like, term sheets and so on, I love the book Venture Deals. It really helped me a lot and helped me know what to expect, and even it helped me a little bit with the negotiation of the round that we just closed. So I highly recommend that to any entrepreneur that's kind of looking into a priced round. Another book that I really love, I actually read that in school, but kind of I keep it next to my bed and I read in it from time to time, is Never Split the Difference. I think it's it's a great book about negotiation. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of background stories there, but there's also quite a few things that you can learn about having a negotiation where you don't necessarily the positive result is not necessarily winning in a simple sense, but actually getting to a situation that's beneficial for both sides. Usually is the win-win situation is really what you're looking for. So these are kind of the more technical books, I'd say. Obviously, there's a huge number of podcasts that I listen to. I think your podcast is obviously incredible, Paul, and I think you bring amazing guests. It's always very inspiring.
Especially in this episode, obviously.
Of course. No, but you get to actually get the feel of who the other founders are, other very interesting characters and so on. But I also think that I think I learned a lot, and there's a book that I always love talking about, that I actually wanted to mention here because it's not a it's not a technical book. It's a novel. It's called The Periodic Table, and by Primo Levi, and it's a collection of short stories that kind of it's an autobiography through these stories, and each one is named after a chemical element. And that book was the reason why I went to study chemistry, and it's a book that I keep on reading again and again. Probably read it 4 or 5 times, and I think it's more than anything, it's a life. It's lessons in life, and I very recommend it more. So.
Awesome. Hey, by the way, Amos, did you hear about why it didn't work out after the date between the biologist and the physicist?
No.
They didn't have any chemistry. Yeah. I was going to tell a periodic table of elements joke, but I thought I might be out of my element if I did. Thank you. Okay, well, it's cool that you're so into chemistry. Let me just ask you, if you weren't doing this, or maybe even if you were, but you wish that there was some other company, almost, that existed to do something good in the world, what would it be? Like, you're doing Chunk Foods, you're committed to this, you're going to be on this ride for some time, it seems. What else do you wish existed that maybe somebody who's listening might be able to go take up the mantle and start on their own?
Yeah. I mean, I tried to think about it for a little bit before this episode, because there's so many interesting challenges right around sustainability, and specifically now, I think sustainability is what all founders should think about, whether their startup actually focuses on a sustainability related question, or just if they do something else and sustainability is just something that they could affect in one way or another. I think if we're talking, I think since, we talk a lot about food here, there are 2 things that I'm very passionate about when it comes to food. I think fat and sugar are 2 unsolved challenges in the food industry. There are so many startups, so many corporations are working on replacements for different fats, on sugar reduction solutions. And I think there's just, there's such a blue ocean there that I encourage every single founder who's interested in these things to work on these huge challenges. It's huge markets with huge impact on people's health and on sustainability. And then another thing that I'm super fascinated about, I don't know if I have an interesting angle on it, but there's so much salt water around us, and on the other hand, there's such a shortage in drinking water and in water for irrigation. I had this vision once of growing food and crops and so on the water, and using the sun, basically free energy from the sun, to desalinate this water and use it for irrigation. So, it's a bit of a dream, but, if someone wants a bigger challenge than making whole muscle cut products out of soy, maybe I should try and pursue something like that.
Yeah. Well, I know Israel is a leader in desalinization efforts for obvious reasons, being by the Mediterranean and without a lot of fresh water. And it was an Israeli Simcha Blas, who invented drip irrigation as well, by the way, which has now saved billions of liters of water all around the world since he invented that. So maybe there's some Israeli out there who's going to figure out the most effective way to actually desalinize water, and we'll have a major breakthrough for sure. But for now, I'm really glad that you're focused on whole muscle cuts made from soy. Again, I can't speak highly enough of soy, and I'm also speaking highly of you and Chunk Foods, Amos. I hope that you all succeed. Can't wait to see your product get out on the market. And congratulations on the fundraising success, the actual product innovation success that you've had so far. And I can't wait to see what happens in the next chapter and chapters of your particular journey here.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found use in this episode. If so, don't keep it to yourself. Please leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, we hope you will be in the business of doing good.